Over the last couple of months, I found myself reaching for very different books. Books that were a little bit quieter, books that felt much easier to enter, and books that kind of felt like companions. And I know that my attention has been pulled in many different areas recently, so much so that when I would sit down to read a book that might have been a little more demanding or a bit heavier, I would immediately feel some resistance. So instead, I've found myself reaching for books that really are led by my mood or my feeling on that day. Some were quiet and comforting, others were a little more absorbing, where I would be entertained no matter how much time I had to read. And some just felt easier to enter when my attention was elsewhere. So when I look back over the last couple of months, I can see that the books that I read were not ones that I was planning to initially read. Instead, I was choosing books that felt the most inviting at that moment. So rather than doing a traditional wrap-up video, which I owe you one for April and also for this month for May, I thought instead I would share with you the books that I chose to read over the last couple of months, when reading just felt a little bit harder, and why I chose them. So first up, Mrs. Palfrey at the Claremont by Elizabeth Taylor. It's one of those books where nothing seems to happen on the surface, but it is quietly observant and it gives you all of the things happening under the surface. Mrs. Palfrey is recently widowed and she's moved into the Claremont Hotel in London, which is described as a haven for the genteel and the decaying. She ends up befriending a young aspiring writer named Ludo, and she comes into contact with a lot of other residents in this hotel that she probably would never have come across in her life normally if she wasn't living there. This whole book feels like it's full of things that are left unsaid. Awkward pauses, politeness, loneliness that is hidden underneath manners, and people trying to preserve some dignity through their very small interactions with each other. I really enjoyed the restraint of it. I liked the underlying humour. Nothing is over-explained, nothing is overly dramatic. It's just really quietly human. And it became one of those books that I looked forward to coming back to in the evening when I just wanted a moment of calm to end my day. I had wanted to read an Elizabeth Taylor novel for a while, and no, not that Elizabeth Taylor, the other Elizabeth Taylor, but I believe this one was her last book published in her lifetime in the early 70s, I think, and I'm looking forward to reading another one. Her writing is really beautiful. Another book that gave a feeling of sparseness in a completely different way was Train Dreams by Denis Johnson. There is so much landscape in this book. There is so much distance and silence. And it reads in a way where you feel like you are remembering someone's life through fragments of time. The small moments, the interactions with other people, losses, seasons changing, and the years passing by very quietly. And Denis Johnson writes with a real restraint as well, where these hard-hitting moments are landing very plainly, which kind of makes them hit harder. Reading Train Dreams felt simultaneously peaceful and sad at the same time. Now, both of these books, Train Dreams and Mrs. Palfrey at the Claremont, are actually quite small books. And at this particular junction in my life, that was a deliberate choice. Because sometimes when you're not sure what to read, choosing a book that is physically smaller and more digestible will give you a small win, which is something that can feel like a real hurdle when you are finding it hard to give a book your attention. But there were also moments where I didn't want quiet and restrained the whole time. I wanted books that would completely pull me out of my head, books that I could disappear into for whether it was 10 minutes that I had or an hour that I had to read. Books that had momentum, that had atmosphere, a very strong sense of place, and books that were easy to disappear into. I honestly deliberated whether I should share this book with you or not because it is so far removed from what I would normally read, but I think that's why it's important right now. The Wicked King is the book that I needed for the experience of reading a book that just had momentum and you went along for the ride. It is a sequel. I actually read the first book, The Cruel Prince, last year, and I did enjoy it. And to be honest, when I read that book, it was probably from a similar place in my life where I needed something that I could just fall into and ride the wave. So I had been saving The Wicked King for a rainy day. And even though I had read the first book months ago, this felt very immersive. It has this sharp and cold atmosphere running through it with political maneuvers, shifting alliances, and characters constantly trying to outthink and outdo one another. And because everything feels a little bit dangerous all the time, it becomes incredibly easy to keep reading just one more chapter. I think what worked particularly well for me at this time with this book was that it felt very immediate. I wasn't sitting at a distance from the story, I felt like I was in it. There's always movement, there's always tension, there's always something happening underlying these characters' dialogue. And sometimes when reading has felt hard for me lately, this is the kind of book that I need to just pull me through it. That kind of narrative momentum was exactly what I needed. It's not necessarily a comforting book like the other two, and it's not a perfect book, but it was a consuming book for me. Another one you might have heard of is Yesteryear by Caro Burke. Yesteryear gave me a similar feeling to The Wicked King, but in a very different way. This book has gotten a lot of momentum in the zeitgeist at the moment, but if you're not familiar with it, it is about a woman named Natalie who is living on a working ranch with her family, her 5 children, I think one more on the way, and her husband. She is a social media influencer and she is living a traditional lifestyle, and immediately in the book you start to realize that there's a lot of smoke and mirrors and a lot of production happening behind the scenes that she isn't showing to her viewers. Those things that make this traditional lifestyle look effortless, which it clearly isn't. But one morning she wakes up and she is faced with a horrible version of her reality where her farm, her house, her family, her husband seem familiar but not as they should be. To me, it had elements of Gone Girl and even Westworld, and I found it really unique and the plot twists were really great. Again, it's not a perfect book, but for a story that examines and explores themes around motherhood and fame and identity and tradition, there is a lot to unpack from this book, but for me, it did the job of just keeping me engaged. Personally, having had a social media account in the past that was also my business and a personal brand, I could empathize with Natalie. Having friends like Natalie who grew up in a very sheltered, faith-centered household, I could also understand. So I really enjoyed it, and I honestly could not wait to pick it up to read throughout the day. And I think what Yesteryear and The Wicked King kind of taught me through this was that reading doesn't always have to be about slowing down and reflecting deeply. Sometimes it can just be about having a book that is entertaining and immersive and gives you the atmosphere you require to just get away for a while. And I think that might be one of the biggest things I've realized over the last couple of months. I wasn't really reaching for books that were based on a genre or an ambition or a goal, or books that I thought I should read at that time. I really reached for books that were based on feeling, whether I wanted something comforting or something consuming. Something that could hold my attention in a very particular way. And eventually that led me to a quieter reading life again. I also noticed that because there was this friction between me and books, I started to become more open to books that other people were talking about, because that felt like a low-hanging fruit that if someone else that I admire or someone who had similar reading taste to me was enjoying, then the chances were that I might enjoy it too. Because there's something reassuring about entering a book when you know other people have been enjoying it. And both Yesteryear and Strangers by Belle were those books for me. This book is everywhere, still everywhere. Even 2 months ago, my book club were talking about it, and it wasn't even the book that we were reading for that month. Everyone was reading it just independently and really enjoyed it. And honestly, that buzz of hearing other people enjoying it made it very easy for me to make the decision to pick it up and give it a go. This memoir follows Belle after the sudden collapse of her marriage during the pandemic, when her husband abruptly relieves her after 20 years of marriage. I found it to be really beautifully written. I loved the writing style of Belle, and isn't so salacious that you might think, where you are, page turning, wanting to see what he said, she said next. Instead, I think it had the momentum of something being unraveled slowly over time. You're not just reading about the breakdown of a marriage, you're with Belle as she starts to examine and reconcile with the person she thought she knew as her husband and the person that is just standing in front of her now. The social conversation around this book or this story is also quite interesting. It is most definitely from a privileged perspective, and Belle doesn't shy away from that with her lineage. But that privilege doesn't mean that it's still not a valid experience or true. It's the kind of book that I kept coming back to because I simultaneously wanted to know why this happened. I wanted to know just as much as she did, but I also wanted to understand or see how she worked her way through this and how she came out of it at the end. And during a period when reading was a little bit harder for me, that immediacy really was surprisingly effective. So the last couple of months have been unusual for me in terms of my reading life, but I can look back and see how these books all kind of met me for different reasons. Some quietened my mind, some absorbed me, and some just reminded me how nice it feels to be invested in a story again. And I think that's all I needed from reading right now, is not the right books, not the books that I thought I should be reading, just books that felt inviting enough to come back to. Sometimes when reading feels difficult, it is very easy to force yourself to read books that will make you come back to that reader that you were, or that you think you should be. But if anything, these last couple of months kind of taught me that instead, I think it's important to go with your instinct and how you're feeling at that time, and follow curiosity to just keep turning the page. Even if that curiosity looks a little different than it used to, or perhaps it's not the highest point on your literary catalogue. But honestly, I'm really grateful for these books that were there at the right time for me and that I continued reading through this. So I would love to know, perhaps if you're in a similar situation to me, what have you been reaching for lately when reading might feel difficult for you? I'd love to know. Thank you so much for joining me. I will speak with you again soon. Have a lovely week of reading ahead. Bye.